Sorry, I was just looking at the interface for setting chat goals for YouTube, which is a bizarre concept, but it's like you're asking people for money and then you'll do something, but I don't want to commit to doing a particular thing, so I just said if you give me $2 in 10 times in an hour, then I will not say the F word. Uh, but yeah, have a think about stuff you'd like for rewards for things like that, because I can't think of any, and I don't have any more time to put in this channel than what I already do. So it's always a bit wary of promising to do more stuff. Thank you. Hi Abdullah in the chat. Thanks for joining. Today we are going to be thinking about interface design for games. This is something that's come up a lot of times when I've asked people what sort of things they want me to cover, and I've been hesitant to put this lecture together because I'm not a specialist in it. I've designed menus in games that have gone out and stuff like that, but it's not an area I necessarily consider to be my own personal strong suit. And I've had a lot of fun doing the research for this, actually. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of work through these slides, take you through some kind of principles you can apply whenever you have to design any sort of interface for a game. Just move this mic in a bit closer. And hopefully you'll come away from that with a sort of set of questions you can ask yourself when you're stuck or when it's not working for you. And I'll mostly be using examples from indie games. You can see here I'm in Into the Breach. I've got my mech behind me. And there are some examples taken from stuff submitted over at the Indie Game Clinic Discord as well, which we'll work through towards the end as a kind of way of thinking about examples and like applying what we've talked about in the lecture to it. As always, these tend to get a bit long. The last couple of these I've done have been about 90 minutes. I will make a shorter version of this. So if you're watching this on the VOD and you're thinking this guy is too slow, there will be a shorter version of this on the channel. It might not be up immediately after this video because I have to take time to edit it, but there will be a shorter version where we edit it all down and make it quicker. Hi Sam, hi Talden, hi Kitten, hi everyone in the chat. Thanks for joining. Yeah, let's see what we can learn about interface design. Some of this might be stuff you know already. A lot of it comes from graphic design, really, and it's kind of the overlap of a lot of concepts from graphic design with a lot of concepts with from product design. And I'm not going to cover like everything we possibly could in this session. I think this will be the sort of topic that maybe we do a new session on every couple of months and refine what's here. But let's kind of just see what we've got. So I'm going to be doing a couple of things, but the main one is taking an approach from a UA designer from a AAA studio that I found in a GDC talk, and then seeing how much of it we can apply to indie games. And we'll apply it to some popular examples of indie games, so you'll see indie games pop up on the screen and you'll know what they are. And you can point at the screen and go, I know that game. Like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme. Or you can say, I don't know that game. I've tried to make sure that they're all labeled, so you always kind of get if a game looks cool, you know what it is, kind of thing. And then we've got some user-submitted examples that have come from Discord members to look at. So kind of a mini version of what we do when we review people's games, but just kind of using those examples to workshop some of these ideas about how to make an interface better. And the first thing to think about is what is an interface for in a game. And these are kind of the three broad goals that I thought of as I was thinking about this question. The first one is there as kind of information. So what information do the players need to understand the game and carry out some actions within the game? And sometimes that's going to be directly interacting with the interface, and sometimes it's going to just be information provided them to do something somewhere else in the game. And that's where we get the distinction between a GUI and a HUD, which we'll go over in a minute. Then there's the second thing, which is kind of making sure an interface is fun to use in its own right. It could be part of your game's juice or toy factor. There could be something enjoyable about clicking on things or moving sliders and all of that kind of stuff. And this is one we often leave out, particularly when we're in early prototyping, because we just want to get the thing working. And interface is often treated as a sort of necessary evil rather than something that is fun about the game in its own right. And then thirdly, one that we're probably all aware of and we think about all the time is the interface provides additional theme or style to the game. You know, you're making a science fiction game, you want it to have a science fiction interface. You're making a fantasy game, you want it to have a fantasy interface. All of that kind of stuff. And it's part of the game's visual branding, right? Which I know that can sound a bit businessy, but when I talk about branding here, I'm really kind of thinking about theming and the just general creative identity of the game. If your game is meant to be very serious or very comedic, you know, those are different tones a game could have, then usually you want to communicate that to some degree in the interface. And one of the tricks I used to use in studios when we were making pitch decks for games, I would use the pitch deck as a way for sort of practicing what the interface might be for this game, right? So rather than just having like a blank pitch deck like this slide and putting content about the game in it, I would make the entire pitch deck feel like it came from the world of the game. That can be a really helpful thing to do early on, because you might not actually be developing that part of the game yet. You might not be hands-on making the art and the code for it, but you can at least do whatever you can to start imagining what that aspect of the game looks like before you have to actually implement it. So this is just those goals restated. The gameplay functionality of the interface, like why do we need it and what does the player need to know and how does the interface help them to understand stuff or carry out certain actions. The inherent pleasure of use, which is what I meant by toy factor. What is enjoyable about using this interface? And then style and signification. So what does the interface evoke in your choice of typography, your choice of colors, all of those things? And I think we all sort of understand that these are the functions of an interface. And the thing that we tend to struggle with is when 1 and 3 on this list are fighting each other. Because we might put something in that's a sort of stylistic choice, like a particular font, and then it makes the interface not work as well because we can't read it very well. So it's not that we don't know what these things are, it's that the iterative process of designing an interface is 1 and 3 having a fight. And you'll have to referee that as the designer and kind of work through that. Lampdog, can you still submit your project for UI review? Not during this session, but yeah, you can always pop it in the Indies Under the Knife thing, and I'll get around to it whenever I get around to it, really. Now, this is a thing that might be worth thinking about from the get-go as well. Because, you know, I see lots of people's games at various different stages, and I don't think there's like a really tried and tested, this is the way that you must develop and release an indie game. But if we imagine that every indie game goes through some version of these 3 stages, right? You're aiming for a commercial launch, and before that you're going to have a sort of online beta or beta where, you know, anyone can test the game, and then earlier on, but you're going to have an early prototype that is maybe just you and your housemate or you and your dog playtesting the game. And I think what to expect of your interface at these different stages is an important thing to think about. You know, lots of people kind of jump straight from here to here, which is one of the things that I'm often very critical of on this channel is, you know, if you haven't been through this stage of testing the game with lots of people that's in the middle, then you shouldn't really be asking people for money and treating it as a commercial launch yet, because you're basically asking for trouble. You know, if you put something out as a $5 game or a $10 game and it plays like a $1 game because you haven't done all this testing, then you're really, really shooting yourself in the foot and likely to make people very, very angry. And I think people do kind of jump into commercial launch too early because they think, well, if I give it away now, then people aren't going to pay for it later. And we have seen time and time again that is not really how things tend to work. And those of you that checked out the Spelunky book review podcast the other day, I did the first episode of a new podcast called The Game Developers Library, and we looked at Derek Hughes' Spelunky book. And, you know, that's an example of a game that was a freeware game played by thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. And that did not stop the kind of premium version of that game selling. So anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but I've put these 3 stages down to try and highlight what I would expect from someone's game in terms of like usability and interface at these different stages. So if we start from the launch and work backwards, the UI needs to be effective, attractive, and thoroughly tested before the game is launched as a paid product. That should be kind of go without saying, really. Now, in your early prototypes over here on the left, you maybe don't need to include every single thing in the UI. And the reason for that is that the developer is usually going to be present to explain things for the playtesters, right? And I've been doing some coaching with a couple of different developers, and I was speaking to one of the people I'm coaching the other day, and I was saying, because he's very much at this stage still where all of his playtests are happening, in a physical place with gamers that he knows. And that means that there might be some stuff that he can just tell them verbally that doesn't need to be in the game, right? But if there's something that players need to be reminded of moment to moment, you don't want to have to lean into their game every 30 seconds and go, remember, the red button does this, then that might be something that you put into an early prototype. But you don't necessarily need to put every single thing into an early prototype. Now, when your early prototype goes to an online beta, and let's say you set up an itch page and you give out a free version of the game to start getting feedback on the game and find out what people like, this is a stage where, your interface doesn't need to be absolutely beautiful. It doesn't need to be the most beautiful thing in the world, but the game does need to be self-explanatory, right? So when you're in this middle stage, when we go into what I'd call blind playtesting, which is, the game is being played and the designer is not there to explain it, then the game needs to be self-explanatory, right? Now, you should probably at this stage also have decided on the art direction. That doesn't necessarily mean every asset in the thing needs to be ready, but, you're going to be testing this with lots and lots of people, and you want to make sure that they get a good understanding of what the game is going for kind of aesthetically, right? So you don't really want to give them a kind of grey box wireframe at this stage, because as we've already established, the UI is part of the visual style of the game. So you at least want them to have a flavor of what the UI is going to look like in the finished game. And you also don't want to have to be like interrupting their gameplay in some way to constantly tell them things, right? You need your interface to do that for itself. So I sort of put these here because I often get questions about, like, what if I'm at this stage in my project? What if I'm not ready to do this yet? I would say these are the 3 kind of big, clear stages of, you're just tinkering on a game, showing it to your friends occasionally, and then you kind of go through these other iterative stages of, okay, now you've made a free version, a demo or something, you're showing it to people, and it kind of, that's the stage where the game needs to be able to sort of stand on its own 2 feet and explain itself without you being in the room to kind of help someone and guide them along. And it really needs to have been tested a while in that stage before you start thinking of it as something to like launch on Steam and ask money for, because otherwise you're just going to end up in a lot of trouble and losing people's trust and stuff like that. I wish I had a housemaid to use as an alpha tester. This is Omar Yunus. This was a really helpful GDC talk when I was putting this together. And we're going to go through some key parts of it in a moment. I would advise you to watch the whole thing. But I'm showing you this slide as a kind of teaser because I think this is really helpful to understand that, every part of game design is iterative. It's very, very rare that you just try and do something and get it right the first time. And just like the example from this slide earlier with, when I said that point 1 and point 3 are going to be fighting each other, in Omar's talk, he talks about the same thing happening in big AAA studios with art direction and cognitive design. So art direction is like all of the stylistic choices of like, what is the art style of the game, when is the game set, and how does that influence things like the graphic design, right? You play a steampunk or diesel punk game like Dishonored, and it has a graphic design that makes you think of that time, and so on. There's all of that stuff going on. And then the cognitive design of like making a thing that people can understand with their brains and their eyes and all of that kind of stuff. And he's sort of describing that you're trying to get the form and function right, but you're feeding in the art direction from one side, the cognitive design from another, and you kind of bouncing between these things as you iterate, right? And I think that's a really helpful place to start, because you're never going to just like read a textbook on UI design and then go, right, excellent, I'm going to make a UI now. And because you read a textbook, you're going to get it right first time, right? You're always going to have to iterate on every part of your game design. And having the kind of information that I'm going to give you today, all that really does is speed up the iteration process, so you don't have to go through as many cycles, because you sort of have a bit more of an understanding of why you might want to do a particular thing. You still always have to understand the context of like why you're doing it there and then. Yeah, I'll add the links on the video description afterwards. Some key terms that are helpful to understand before we start as well. You might have heard these before. HUD, GUI, or GUI, if you're a disgusting person who likes to call it a GUI. The diegesis, which is a term that we take from film and theatre studies, and front end. And this set of terminology is really helpful for us to understand what part of the game we're talking about whenever we approach interface. So the difference between a HUD and a graphical user interface is that GUI describes any of this overlay that is over the game world, right? Any of it is graphical user interface. It is graphical because we can look at it. It is a user interface because it's there for the user to interface with the game, to interact with the game. Whereas the HUD is just this passive information at the top, which is there to provide kind of context for what the player is doing, but most of the time a lot of this stuff isn't clickable. And I've used StarCraft as an example because RTS games have this very clear design pattern of the passive information is at the top and the active stuff that you click on is at the bottom. But there are lots and lots of genres that follow some variation of this design pattern, and that is because, yeah, the top stuff is HUD. It is there to provide information. You look up at it, and you don't necessarily move your mouse up there very often, right? And if you think of like the player has two things that they're using. Well, if they've got their brain as well, but their kind of hands and their eyes, and asking the player to look up at the corner is not asking much of them. Asking them to move their mouse up there is asking a little bit more of them, right? So we tend to try and condense the interactive parts of an interface together, or they can be spread out if they're things we don't click on all the time. But if you've got things that you click on all the time and they're all in different corners of the screen, then you're going to be like asking a lot of people to have them move their mouse around a lot. The term diegesis in the bottom left just refers to the fictional world that we're looking at in a piece of media. So, for example, if we think of a film, the diegesis is the world that the characters inhabit, and if we say something is diegetic, then it's happening in that world. And when we say something is non-diegetic or extra-diegetic, then it's happening outside of that world. So, for example, characters generally can't see the text in the credits, right? That is a non-diegetic or extra-diegetic. It's outside the diegesis. They usually can't hear the music if the music is an OST, unless it's like something that is playing from a radio in the world, in which case it's diegetic again. So the GUI is like this layer that is put on top of the thing for the player to interact, and then the diegesis is the world that the characters inhabit. And sometimes you might have graphical user interface that feels more or less in the diegesis. So an example in RTS games would be health bars, where they're still not really part of the diegesis. The players can't see them. They don't exist in the fictional world of the game, but they are kind of in that 3D environment, whereas the GUI is laid on top of it. Yeah, Stefan in the chat has highlighted the classic example of a diegetic UI is in Dead Space. Isaac has a health bar on his back. That's a really classic example. We saw one of these last week, I think it was. We had that puzzle platformer on the channel with the little robot. It was called Control Yourself. He had a lovely little health bar on his chest as well. And then the term at the bottom right, front end, is kind of referring to everything that the user can see and interact with. So if you come from a kind of computer science or an engineering background, you'll be familiar with the terms front end and back end. And usually that's referring to, you know, the front end is the app and the back end is the server, right? But within an app, we can also have a front end and a back end of like what is under the hood and what does the user see. So when we talk about front end, when we're talking about interface, it is basically all of these things working together. It's the graphical user interface, which includes the HUD, but it's also the diegesis as well. And this is going to be helpful to think about later on because, you know, if you're a game, particularly if you're an indie game dev and you're working on every part of your game, there is an approach where instead of thinking about the user interface as this separate thing that you lay on top, you treat everything in the game as if it's interface, right? Everything in the game is potentially something for the player to interact with or something that the player needs to look at and understand to get information from. And the Dead Space example is a good example of a piece of diegetic interface where it's like that thing is there in the game world, other characters could see it, and it takes over the role of a health bar. But there are lots of other examples of that kind of thing, and I think the most obvious one in AAA games at the moment would be something like yellow painting, where you make it really obvious where something is climbable, right? And a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people are very much against it. But there are all sorts of decisions that go into the visual design of elements of your game that are going to make it more or less playable. And that's just a kind of example of like a maybe a overcompensatory approach to designing environments, you know. So in this example, the HUD is giving us all of this at a glance information, usually about things that we don't need to interact with right now. Maybe I can click up here and cancel things in my production queue, but I'm not doing that all the time. It's a rare action. The GUI is used for moment-to-moment player actions. Like in this case, I can click on the map and it moves the camera to that point of the map. There's unit selection stuff along here as well that I can click on. I don't think this is part of the game. I think this is... I don't know. I haven't played StarCraft in years. And then the diegesis is the, you know, the game world, and there will be some interface elements in there like health bars. Ryson, I don't actually know Fitz lore, so if you want to drop it in the chat, I will talk about it. I might have heard it before, but might not have heard it with that title or that name. Another example, again, this is a very interface heavy game where you are not really directly controlling anything in the game world. But in Slay the Spire, we've got, you know, passive HUD at the top. Here's all my relics, all my little things that I've collected. I occasionally want to move my mouse up there and highlight them to remind me of what they do. But most of the gameplay is happening down here, closer to me. This is the graphical user interface as the cards. And then in the diegesis, we've got basically the kind of current situation that the player is in that I need to read and respond to, right? So... an interesting thing here is you've got like 2 health bars. We've got the player's health up there and down here. But this is kind of like giving the broader context of the whole game, right? Of like how much gold I've got, what floor I'm on. I think this might be how many enemies I've killed. I can't remember. This is like the broader context of the game. And then this in the center is much more what I need to focus on right now. I'm fighting the heart. The heart has this much health and these statuses and stuff like that. And I'm using my cards to interact with this stuff here, right? If this was arranged in such a way that I had my cards here, and then all of this information was here, and then the thing I was interacting with was up the top, it would start to feel weird because I'm interacting with the diegesis using my GUI, but there's a bunch of stuff in the middle that is just like creating a gap between those things. Error rate of interaction versus distance and size. Right, so does that mean if I have to, again, if I have to move too far, then I'm more likely to do a thing I'm not intending to do because it's kind of tiring me out as a user to do that. That kind of makes sense. I don't know. The time it takes to hit a button. Excellent. So Lampdog in the chat, we'll come back to this later because it comes around at the end of this question of what happens if everything is interfaced. But we'll come back to that. You know, what's the point of separating it? Yeah, I mean that is kind of something to think of in the design process. Is what can I put in the game world, and you know, when do I hit a point when I need the interface over the top? And sometimes you just need both. The thing that I frequently see is people add a health bar and they think that because they've added a health bar, that is the only thing they need to do to show when the player gets hurt or to communicate to the player that they're nearly going to die or any of that kind of stuff. And then they don't add, you know, enough feedback for when the player is getting hit. They don't add anything to show when the player character is nearly dead. They don't add anything in the diegesis to communicate that. They try and just communicate it through the interface. And often what you need are multiple ways of communicating the information so that you can't miss it. And that's kind of often where the interface comes in, is like adding this layer of redundancy on top of it. We have a player character. We can see when they get hit. They go into an animation state when they're nearly dead that is like limping around or something. And then the health bar is there as well, so that we have multiple ways of getting that information. So Omar Yunus's talk from 2018 GDC, I'm going to step through this. This is quite a long talk in its own right, but I've just picked out the key bits that I think we can use. And generally, in AAA games, they are aiming for the UI to almost disappear. And this is going to be very, very true in like games like first-person shooters where you're trying to immerse a player in a world. Now, you can already probably think of indie games where this is the opposite of this is true, right? Where, you know, even Slay the Spire is an example of this. Because Slay the Spire is a card game, the entire game is interface because the cards are interface. You know, they don't exist in the game world. So this is a game where there is no intention of making the interface disappear, right? The interface is front and center. It is the thing that you are playing. But in the context of like AAA adventure action games, often you're kind of aiming for it to not be front of mind. And again, like I talked about at the beginning, the UI is part of communicating the brand identity of the game. And you want to use as many senses as you can with this. So this is why we have like, you know, when you move through a menu and all of this kind of stuff. It kind of lets you know the game isn't frozen as well, right? And thinking about those stages of development I talked about earlier, when you're in that middle stage and you're sending your game out to like random people, this is probably the stage where you want to have some of that basic polish on your interface. Like when I click a button, does it have a down state that communicates that I clicked it, right? All of that kind of stuff is not to be left entirely to the end, because it's part of what helps players understand what the interface is doing, whether it's working properly, if anything is frozen, all of that kind of stuff. And then Yunus takes us into thinking about visual cognition, which is like the science behind how our eyes work. So one of the reasons why red draws the eye is because the cones in our eye are more sensitive to it, right? There are more of them kind of closer to the center. I'm not entirely sure of the exact science, but that means that red stands out more in an image. And it means that yellow also stands out more in an image because yellow is a combination of red and green, right? So yellow stands out more than blue and stands out more than green, and then red stands out the most, right? These are just the kind of key points from the visual cognition part of Yunus's talk, and then we get into Gestalt theory, which I'm going to go through in more detail than some of this stuff. But a lot of this will kind of be stuff that you just understand at a gut feel level because you've played enough games and you've thought about how games work. The center is the kind of where the crucial information needs to be, right? Because that is just what we pay attention to if we're looking at something like a screen and everything around the periphery is peripheral, right? There's a reason why we use the word peripheral to describe something that is not as important, right? It's a spatial metaphor. Something can be in the center of something or in the periphery. That's a spatial description, like on this kind of screenshot here. But if something is peripheral, if it's on the edges, then we perceive it as being less important. And that's why we put stuff that's less important around the edges. That's often why, again, if we come back to the health bar example, putting a health bar up in the corner is often not enough to communicate to the player that they are going to die, right? And this is why we kind of throw damage vignettes and stuff on the screen so that there is something a bit more central letting you know that you're getting hurt. And then this last point is, this is like the sequence of perception that we tend to see the shape of things first, then the color of them, and then the form or the details within that shape, right? So this kind of comes to, I often talk about doing the squint test when you're looking at a game. If you can kind of blur the whole image or squint at it slightly, could you still play the game? And the thing that usually makes that possible is this kind of stuff. Is there a very clear shape difference between, I don't know, objects that are enemies and objects that are friends, that kind of thing? And if you don't have a very clear shape difference, then you've got to rely on other things. But, if you make a game that is just about circles, it's going to be considerably more difficult for someone to play than a game that is about circles, squares, and triangles that have different functions, because you can immediately kind of mentally map those shapes onto the behaviors in the game. And then we've got a list of helpful usability principles. I'm going to rush through these now, but we will be coming back to these at various points. So the first one, the maximum of 7 unique items. So this is the idea that if I'm looking at a screen in your game, if there are more than 7 things for me to kind of take in and think about and understand separately as different things, then I'm going to get overwhelmed. And this is to do with how most people's short-term memories work. I know there was a stream recently where we were talking about this. If you have a card game, most card games start you off with between 3 and 5 cards, and 7 as an absolute maximum. And that is because 7 unique items is the limit for most people's cognition in terms of sort of understanding different options, right? So if I, play a game of Magic the Gathering and I start with 10 cards, but 5 of those are energy or land cards, they just do the same thing. That doesn't really count as 5 different options. That's just kind of one thing for me to understand, right? Which is why in things like deck builders, it's okay to give people more cards if some of them are really, really basic. But if you give people 7 cards and each one of them has a different complicated rule on it, you're going to start putting quite a lot of cognitive load on people. And this doesn't just apply to cards, it applies to any sort of interface situation where we've got lots of little bits of information around the place. People usually can't handle more than 7 because it's just a limitation of our short-term memory, how many things we can hold in our head and kind of keep there and compare with each other. There's this story about Wozniak in Apple where he used to look for programmers who could remember more than 7 digits in a row because he believed that was like a basic indicator that someone could be really, really good at computer programming because they have a inherently better short-term memory than other people or whatever. The other usability principles, number 2, maximum 3 levels of menu depth. So you're trying to not make a menu that has so many. If you imagine going into folders in your computer, right? The more folders you have to go into, subfolders, the more likely you are to get lost and not remember how to get back to different places, right? So this is just a kind of rule within his studio, but it's one that makes quite a lot of sense. Unless you're making a game that is about getting lost in menus, you probably don't want people to get lost in menus, right? The third one, affordances, is a general principle in design. Affordance theory is just the kind of idea that when you look at an object, it kind of suggests a particular interaction, right? So, here's one. A mug has a handle on it, right? Oh, my mug is green screening out. My lovely playtester Tears mug, it has a handle on it, right? And because I have hands and I've interacted with things with handles before, if I see a totally new object, an alien object in the environment, and it has this shape on it, I'm going to understand that that is an affordance that is there for me to hold as a handle, right? And even if you pick up a natural object and it has that shape on it, you'll go, oh, lovely, built-in handle. And when this transfers to visual design, this is things like, okay, I know that that bit is a button because it looks like a button. And it's sort of, there's something about the design that separates this from the stuff around it and lets me know that I can interact with that in a certain way, right? I look at a slider and my kind of contextual knowledge about how those work generally allows me to know that that is going to move along if I click and drag on it. But it's also just kind of designed to look like a physical object, which would allow someone to kind of slide a bead along a line or whatever. You've got focus area, which is stuff like highlighting things when they're important. You know, we see this a lot in tutorial design where we're not just kind of saying, do this now. We're saying, do this now, and then like darkening the screen and highlighting the area that we want people to focus on and all of that kind of stuff. Making sure that there are clear state changes in the interface. Again, this is to do with highlighting things when they're more or less relevant, having switches and so on. Number 6 is the page flow, which is kind of just the general way that people read a screen. They read from left to right and top to bottom. And there are kind of places in that you can see heat maps for this where in cognitive design there'll be kind of certain places in the page that you don't want to put something really important because people will ignore it, and that tends to be the bottom left in a lot of screen and print based things, and help and hints, right? So these are kind of like the 7 things. And if you think of like, how is this applicable to something I'm working on, right? So if you're making a game and people seem to be struggling to get the idea of it, and you know you've got a fun game, but when you give it to playtesters, they don't seem to be interacting with it in the way that you've intended. This is the sort of list where you could probably step through this and you could use it as a checklist. Like, am I giving people too much information? Am I giving them more than 7 things to think about at any once? Are there things that people should interact with that aren't visually designed to have affordances that make it clear what is and isn't a button? All of that kind of stuff, right? There's a list of principles here you can use in that kind of way as a checklist. And this is kind of it narrowed down a little bit. So the first point are those usability principles we just looked through. The second point is aligning the interface with the creative direction, which is what I showed earlier in that bouncing between creative direction and cognitive design. It's like that is always going to be a bit of a fight as you're iterating on your interface as you build your game, because you want it to be functional, you want people to understand it, you want to do the cognitive design side of things, but you want the interface to be stylish and communicate something about the tone of the game and the world of the game. The third point on here I thought was really interesting, and I've got some examples of this from indie games in a minute, but this is making sure that you do research on other media and how graphic design is done in other media. So how do apps do their graphic design? You know, how does Duolingo do its graphic design? All of that kind of stuff. How does graphic design work in magazines and posters? All of those kind of things. And often the 3 feeds into 4, because Gestalt theory has been a kind of standard thing in graphic design for like 100 years now. And we're going to go into that now in a bit more detail. So this will be a bit of a reminder if you've done this stuff before. But Gestalt theory is like it's a set of observations that we've had in the last 100 years or so about how people perceive images, right? So we've already talked a little bit about color bias and kind of bias towards like information being situated in a particular place, like central versus peripheral, and you know, the bias that we have for shape, then color, then form. But Gestalt theory just kind of gives us more depth on that kind of stuff, really. So yeah, the Gestalt principle, or a set of Gestalt principles. So if you've heard any of those terms before, they refer to the same thing. The thing that makes this quite hard to learn about is you will find a list of Gestalt principles for graphic design or UI design or web design, and they're always slightly different, right? They're always a little bit different from each other. And I'm not going to go through like every version of this, because you can go on Google now and look up Gestalt principles, and you will find a bunch of different listicles that have different things in the list and different things missing, right? So again, all we can really do is sort of understand how these things generally work and then come back to them when we need a refresh. And like when you're playing a game you really like, and particularly if it's a game that's similar to the types of games you want to make, you can take this away and apply it to that game and that game's interface and that game's graphic design, and try and see how these things have been applied. Because, you know, particularly in bigger studios, they are going to have sort of graphic designers, interface designers that understand all of this stuff way better than I do, right? So if you're making a RTS and you're going back and playing StarCraft, or you're making a card game and you're going and playing Hearthstone, by studying that game and looking at how they do particular things, you're going to be getting this stuff by proxy, because they will already have tried to adhere to all of this stuff as much as possible. So this is a nice opener, though, because it's showing some of the principles using the text, right? Gestalt, yeah. It kind of changes every time. I don't have a very good set pronunciation for it. So this is showing some of the principles. Closure is the idea that if we look at a set of complex information where something appears to be missing, our mind will just fill in the blanks, right? Proximity is the idea that things that are closer together, we perceive them as belonging together, right? We kind of, again, it's a kind of a filling in the gaps, but it's kind of a grouping, right? And a lot of this has a particular, when you do it in graphic design, it's just like, oh, do I look at that G and do I see a G? Do I look at that E and see a G, even though it's cut up by all these lines? But when we start to think about interfaces in games, it adds this other layer of depth to it, because it's like, okay, I'm looking at a list of icons, and is there something about the way that they're arranged that tells me something about how they belong together, or that kind of stuff? So the way this interacts with usability is quite complex when you think about it too much. And yeah, I'll go through the examples, because I think this is a kind of neat little visual joke, but I don't think it's actually good for explaining them the first time. So one of the principles is the figure ground. Gestalt. Yeah, I need to get the st in the middle. Gestalt. There we go. The figure ground is a bias that we have for identifying a figure in a background, right? And it's quite a difficult one to apply in games, but we do have a lot of use of silhouettes in games, right? So this is kind of your ability to look at something and understand what is the object and what is the surrounding void of that object. And this comes in a lot when you're designing very simple icons. Sorry, Furfur. Yeah, I'm never going to do a programming lecture, because I might occasionally talk about something I've programmed and go, look at my stupid programming. But it's never going to be like directly about the technical implementation of something, because it's just not something I'm good enough at. It's also like incredibly specific to what framework you're using. And even if I was a very, very good programmer, I would avoid doing that kind of technical stuff, because when you're thinking about game design, you want to be reasonably platform agnostic and just go, right, this is the type of game I'm trying to make. These are the features I want. You know, like, what's the best tool for that, rather than getting locked into particular frameworks and stuff like that. So yeah, the figure ground is when we look at an object, when we look at a representation of an object, we can tell what is the object and what is not the object. And if you think of those like early AI images that we got from like DALL-E 1, what was happening when you looked at one of those, I wish I put an example on here now, is that when you look at one of those, you can't identify what the objects are. It's all sort of blurring into one thing, and it creates this really uncomfortable feeling. If you go back and look at those early AI pictures where it's kind of like a weird dream, that's kind of what it's playing around with here, and that's why it makes you feel so uncomfortable to look at it, because there aren't clearly distinct objects that your brain could kind of pick up and go, there's that, you know? Similarity is really just the idea that when we make things look the same, then we perceive them as doing the same thing, right? This is what that would mean in the context of games, at least. So this is Vampire Survivors. You can see there are these different little objects floating around on the HUD here. I think I might even be hiding some down this corner. There we go. And they all have this directional arrow on, right? So even if I've never played this before, I can kind of move around a little bit and see these directional arrows moving around in relation to me. And if I go over towards this crown, you know, it seems like I'm getting closer to the crown. And now I understand that because these other things have a directional arrow on, they probably mean the same thing as that directional arrow. I'm putting them in a kind of mental category based on them looking the same, right? And then if we look at the and again, thinking about that kind of annoying everything is interface thing, right? These are examples that are in the GUI that are on the top layer of the game that don't exist in the game world. But you can apply this to things like the enemy design, right? The fact that all of these enemies look identical makes me expect them to behave the same. If all of these were like slow moving enemies and then one of them moved really fast, came up to me and said, "Hello, I'm Bob," that would break my brain because I'm expecting them to share the same functionality because they look the same. Proximity as a Gestalt principle is the idea that things will be perceived as similar or related if they are grouped together physically, right? So the last one was if they look the same, even if they're spread out, we will perceive them as being the same. This is, we can take things that are maybe different from each other and put them close together. And, you know, part of this is down to us reading intention, right? If I'm a gamer and I play your game and I see you've put stuff together, I'm going to assume you've done that for a reason, right? So when I look up here in the top left in Invisible Ink and I see my credits are up here, I'm going to think, well, maybe that's related to my list of agents in some way because you've put it there together. But in the context of Gestalt principles, it's much more that, you know, this is like a kind of human thing we do. If we see things that are close together, we think that they're related in some way, right? So these down here, okay, they are similar. If we think about the last principle, they are images in squares and they have a number underneath. They are similar in that way, but they are also proximal. They are close together, right? We could take these and just spread them around the outside and they wouldn't have the proximity anymore. They'd still be associated by being like a similar shape, but the fact that we've grouped them all together here lets us know that they kind of belong together as a concept, not just as a set of images, right? So we look at this and we think, okay, this is a set of things that are related. And then we see there's a sequence of numbers and then we go, okay, that's part of how they're related. That's probably like keyboard shortcuts or something like that. These are all clues that add up to, again, if we think of those stages of development earlier, these are clues that add up to the player being able to play the game without you needing to lean over their shoulder and go, click that, click that, click that. These are all the clues that allow the game to speak for itself. Common region is like proximity, but it's less to do with things just being close together and more the fact that they are contained in some way, right? So here we have one of the screens from Darkest Dungeon and we have some areas that are containers for things, right? So over here on the right, there's some highlighting already here. I think I might have pinched it from someone else's site. Over here on the right, we have a kind of vertical list of things that are within a container. Down here is where you kind of put your party members to build your party before you send them out. But this has its own little border, right? So you could say, well, yeah, that's contained in a common region, but also it's similar and also it's proximal. These are 4 squares that are the same and they are proximal. They're next to each other. But that's the kind of the point, is that you are building like sets of these relationships at the same time. So you might not need things to have a little border around them to tell you that that is a distinct area where this thing happens. But we've got 3 clues, right? We've got the common region of that border, we've got the proximity of those 4 things, and we've got the similarity of those 4 things. And the more of those clues we stack, the easier the thing is to understand, right? So that's kind of perhaps what's helpful about thinking of of Gestalt as a set of principles is, if you've got something in your game that people aren't understanding, well, maybe it's that you've only applied one of those principles. And if you apply 3 or 4 of those principles, maybe people are going to understand it better, right? Other examples of common region, down here, this stuff is contained in this little grey bit, right? Our money is contained in this little grey bit. We've got these are called heirlooms, which are the things you collect to upgrade your town. This is our money, right? These are different from each other. These are similar in the sense of the typography that they've got and this little purple outline. And the money has a different typeface. It is larger, but they are contained within the same common region because they are all kind of currencies that we use in the game, right? Then these icons have their own common region over here because they are related to each other in a similar way. Ammo near gun icon proximity says it's the ammo for that specific gun. Yeah, that's a good example as well, right? A lot of these things, they feel really obvious when you go through them like this, but that's kind of the thing. It's like when we look at someone else's game, it's usually easier to see what they're doing well or what they're doing poorly. And when it's our own game, there are a bunch of things getting in the way. It's like that we as the developer understand the game too well, so we don't understand what other people don't understand, so we can't design for it. And there's also the kind of implementation gap of like, oh, I don't really want to put that box down there in the UI because that's going to take me 2 hours, right? Those are the two things that tend to be working against us to kind of make better interfaces as developers in small teams or as solo developers. We know how much work it's going to take, we don't want to do it, and we can't really see what we need to do because we just understand how everything works because we built it in the first place, right? So going through this stuff and looking at other people's games can be really helpful because it kind of builds up your instinct. And that's kind of the whole part of the whole rationale behind how this channel is structured is, it's a lot easier for us to get better at things when we look at kind of other people's work in progress and critique it. It's why they do that kind of stuff in university classes, Partly it's to help people develop a thicker skin because they're showing your work to each other, and kind of getting over that fear of failure and of being mocked or whatever you think is going to happen. But it's also so that everyone who is giving the critique can develop this better kind of gut instinct of how that thing should be, because it's very hard to develop it when you're looking at your own work because you don't want to make the change, so you don't look for what needs to change a lot of the time. Continuity. This was a hard one to find a game example of. So this is the kind of the visual demonstration of this principle that you see all of the time, is that when we put things on a line or a curve, we see them as related. So if you build like overlapping lines, if I look at these two lines without the color coding, I would read this line as one set of things and then the vertical line as another set of things. When we introduce the color coding, it makes you read the continuity differently, right? So if these were both black lines, well, first off, I would perceive them as two lines still, right? I would perceive one line going down and one curved line. But the color is sort of throwing that off a little bit and making me kind of look at this in a different way. Factorio doesn't work if you can't perceive the colors of these lines, as far as I'm aware. The examples of this would be things like when you've got lines around an interface, like there's like a line along here. These things are on a line. I'm not kind of sure of better examples of this from games because it always gets kind of illustrated with these two curvy lines overlapping each other. Symmetry. I think the important thing to understand about this, because I'm going to have a slide on asymmetry in a minute as well, and the important thing to take away for this one is that what we're not saying here is that symmetry is always good and everything should be symmetrical, right? The point is that when things are symmetrical, you perceive the two mirrored sides as being related to each other, right? So again, it's our brains are taking a spatial thing, like the way things are arranged, and morphing it into a cognitive thing to do with other types of relationships, right? And our brains are very good at this. We do this all the time. You know, when we dream, we turn time into space, and all of these other kind of. We take one type of relationship and we turn it into another one. That is what's going on with the type of cognitive design that Gestalt theory is all about. It's about seeing a visual relationship and turning it into some other type of relationship in our head, right? That might not exist, but the point is when we are designing things for usability, we make that relationship exist so that that cognitive bias we have when we look at things actually helps people understand the game, right? So this is the health and ammo that you have in GoldenEye. It is a symmetrical heads-up display, and we can see that these are two things that are related to each other. Now, the color is a difference. So the color is indicating that maybe there's a reason why one is orange and one is blue. Maybe these things aren't totally the same, right? But they are the same in some way, otherwise they wouldn't be symmetrical, right? So these are both resources that can deplete. When we see this in action, we see it get darker as you run out of one thing or the other. And the symmetry kind of tells us they're going to work in loosely the same way. And then the color informs us that symmetry is not total, right? But as I said, symmetry isn't always a goal. Sometimes you want to make it clear that things are different, right? So this kind of thing, one of the things you will have noticed in like top-down CRPGs in the last 10 or 20 years, so things like Disco Elysium, things like the newer Shadowrun games, they've tended to go for this format where you've got the text in a column down the side. And that does a couple of different things. One is it makes the text way easier to read than if you have it in a very, very long horizontal thing, which is what Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 did. It's what the old Fallout games did. They had the text along the bottom in this very widescreen way. And text is harder to read like that because you get to the end of your line and then your eye has to travel further. So it's kind of that... what was the law we were discussing earlier about distance of eye travel and stuff like that? And this is part of the reason why newspapers have their text in columns as well. You can read it much, much quicker, right? So that is one of the reasons why we get this layout in more modern CRPGs that are informed a bit more by cognitive design. But also, it's allowing us to understand that this is different from this, right? These two areas of the screen are for different things. This is the game world. This is the diegesis. We can see the characters here. And then over here is the kind of the social story of what people are saying and what our character is thinking. And they are separate from each other. And, creating that asymmetry helps to give the screen a very clear sense of what this part of the screen is for and what this part of the screen is for, Yeah. Fitzlaw, thank you. Sorry, the delay. I'm talking really fast, and then I look around and you've answered a question from like 45 seconds ago. But the point is that symmetry and asymmetry aren't inherently good or bad. Symmetry is there to help to kind of tell us that things are the same. It can help to create a sense of order as well, to have things symmetrical. When things are asymmetrical, it tells us those things are different from each other, and it also can kind of create a sense of dynamism. It can also be helpful for navigation as well. And this is less to do with interface and more to do with level design. But a problem I've seen a lot with kind of junior level designers or environment designers is they make locations that are too symmetrical. And there might be some gameplay reasons for doing that, like balance, if you're making a multiplayer competitive map. But often you get environmental designers, they look at a building in the real world, they see a building as symmetrical, and they just make a symmetrical building in a game. And that makes it harder to navigate because we don't have a sense of difference of like, oh, that side of the building is like this and this side of the building is like this, because it's too symmetrical, right? So asymmetry in that case is about creating a sense of dynamism. It's about creating a sense that this is different from this. And that's going to help us understand that if I go in that room, it's that room. And if I go in this room, it's this room. That's an example of where symmetry can kind of lead to confusion, right? That's from level design. But it's, again, level design is still a kind of visual cognitive thing. So you can apply these things there, even if on the surface they more obviously apply to graphic design and user interface design. Here we have the Gestalt principles up in the top, and Darkest Dungeon, because I love Darkest Dungeon. But you can kind of take them, and again, like I said, you will find a different list of principles wherever you look this up. But the point isn't to sort of know them all. The point is to be able to apply a couple of them and see how a game works in a particular way, right? So, okay, if we take one of these and apply it, similarity, the abilities that the character can do are grouped together. They have the same function. They're obviously not all the same because they're abilities. They're supposed to be different from each other. But I understand that they are the same group of things, and the way I interact with them is the same. I click on one of them, and then I get asked to pick a target, whether it's one of my guys or one of their guys, right? I don't ever get a ability where I click on it and then it asks me to click on the skeleton down here because the proximity of these things and the similarity of these things is teaching me their behavior, and the behavior is always that I click on one of these and then I click on a character in the diegesis. Is there any others here that we can kind of think about? There's a symmetry here of characters here, and again, it's kind of like the GoldenEye health bar example. There's things that are the same, where it's telling us that one aspect of these two things is the same, and then there's things that are different that's telling us that you shouldn't assume that these are exactly the same thing, right? So by having this symmetry, we know that these four on the left and these four on the right are the same in some way. They're both characters. They both have health bars. You know, they are conceptually roughly the same thing. But the fact that they're apart and the fact that they have different visual design tells us that those are enemies and those are friends, right? And we read the game left to right. This is a common thing as well in if you think right back to the start, we talked about kind of page read order. Generally in left to right languages, when you are playing a game and you come from a left to right reading background, you associate left to right with progress, right? So you wouldn't have this combat with everyone switched around so the players are on the right, because that would imply that you were walking backwards and you were running away from something or whatever. It's one of the things I always struggled with RPG Maker, is RPG Maker forces you to have characters on the right battles, and it just feels a bit wrong unless you're deliberately trying to make people think your game is Japanese, which a lot of people in that community actually want. Brandon James Greer is coming up as is that like an art person for games or a UX person for games? Yeah, Stefan's talking about the dialogue boxes in those old CRPGs. Yeah, with a narrower screen, you can fit more on, and like just inherently bigger text as well because of the older screens. But you can see, like, Darkest Dungeon is a game that is all interface, and you can kind of just pick it apart for hours with this stuff. One of the things that I find interesting is, like, if you look at the stuff where you are managing your party outside of a mission and then within a mission, there is there is relatively little stuff that actually carries across. Like, you look at these two things and you understand they're from the same game because the style is the same, and there are loads of kind of common design elements in terms of style. But this menu and this menu, they do not actually share the like position of particular things. In fact, I think the only thing I can see that is familiar between these is like this guy's portrait. Like, the portraits are used here and here, but everything, and what I'm trying to convey with this is that if you look at this game, what you quickly understand is that every screen of this game has been built from first principles of what is the player doing right now, what do they need to be able to understand, and they're not building it from the basis of like what's easy for me as a developer to do, right? They're not going, well, on the last screen this was in this place, so I'm going to leave it there because it would be hard for me to move it. No, they're building everything from the basis of like, what does the player need to understand at this moment? And that's why we don't have like the money indicator when you're in a dungeon, because it's not relevant when you're playing in the dungeon, right? And if you think back to that idea of cognitive load from earlier and not having more than seven different things, you know, having the money on that battle screen might be the thing that just tips that over the edge into something that we can't understand. So, you know, think of that 7 things rule. Over here, I've got 1 here for characters, 1 here for missions. I've got some stuff here explaining the quest I'm on. I've got rewards here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 if I perceive all of these currencies as one thing. 6 here for the little thing I drop my characters into, which could be seen as an extension of them, and then 7 here, right? This is a relatively complex screen in terms of an interface, but it still obeys that rule of not having more than 7 distinct things. Now, we can have, when I say 7 things, I mean like 7 categories of thing, right? We can have loads of different characters, and again, if we think back to Gestalt, we're going to read that as a set of things, right? So cognitively, we see that and we see a list, and we don't need to immediately pass all of the information in that list. We can just go, okay, there's a list of characters there. And we can look at this in the middle and say, okay, there's a bunch of missions here. And if I want to think about which mission to do, I can then focus in on that and pick one and so on. But in terms of the whole screen, there's like one thing here, 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 and one thing here. And the ones that are not relevant for during the gameplay are not there, right? They're just not there. So we don't have the currency when we're playing. And all of that is about just trying to keeping the amount of information that the player needs to take on board at any given time to the bare minimum. And then there are all sorts of visual things going on to make sure that you're not concentrating on the right place, on the wrong place as well, right? Which brings us back to the squint test from earlier. If I blur these images, like here's the color version on the left, right? The text stands out really well because it's kind of a warm color and it's lighter. The dark background is really dark, and also the kind of art, when the art is kind of background art, it just stays black and grey. And then when it's a character or something important, that's when we sort of have the colour rationed to make it pop. But even if you take colour out of the picture and you look at this black and white version, you can see the difference in value, right? And if you're making a game that's very soft and pastel, you need different ways to achieve this. You need maybe you have a very soft pastel background, and then there are certain things that you make very bold and dark to stand out on top of that. But you need some kind of language of how you push things back and how you bring things forward. And if you don't have that, then people are just going to read it as a bunch of noise. I think a really good reference point for pastel games for a really good interface is Bad North. I should have put it in here, but I just didn't think until just now. Bad North is a great example of a game that's got this lovely, lovely washed out pastel aesthetic, but the really important things in the GUI have very bold colors that stand out really nicely. So that's a cool one to look at as well. So again, this is just information hierarchy stuff that we've talked about before. So information hierarchy is just the idea of there are things that are more important for someone to pay attention to, right? And you can apply this to something like, let's say you're making a poster for an event. What is the first thing that someone needs to pay attention to in order to interest them? That should be at the top of the information hierarchy. And something like a contact number for the event organizer will be right at the bottom, because it doesn't matter if people have to look around for that a little bit, because you don't really care if people can't find that information. Same principle here. We build a hierarchy of what's the most important thing, and then we add as much information to that, or as much kind of as many stylistic choices to it as possible to make it stand out, right? So here we've got more use of color. We've got a different use of outlines. So down here, the stuff that's not really important is just the black and grey, right? And we've got a lower, each thing we can see within the art has a lower internal contrast, because if we look at these trees here, okay, they use the same black outlines as everything else, but the kind of difference between the black and the brown there is hardly anything. Whereas up here, we've got black outlines, and then we've got like garish pinks and these bone colors and everything. It's creating a lot of contrast, so when we look at that object, we know it's important because it's got high internal contrast. Same with the Plague Doctor's little icons here. They have different colors from each other, which is kind of acting as a mnemonic thing for us to understand that this is a poisonous thing and this is a thing that causes bleeding. There's information there. Again, it's not just adding the information to explain the things, which is what all this is, right? So, you know, a skull is a boss, and a green skull is an easy boss. A red, whatever this grid means, is like a scouting mission, but it's a red one, so it's hard. There's that information, right, that is important for players to have, and like the color coding on these abilities and all of that kind of stuff. But it's also about how do you create a sort of bland background for that information to pop out on. And the thing about information hierarchy is if you make everything look important, then nothing is important anymore, right? So you have to have some way of saying that things aren't important, and that could be making them dark. It could be blurring them. It could be making them washed out and pastel and then having darker things pop out on top of it. There are lots of different ways of achieving that, but it depends on the style of your game as well. I should have had some jazz music to trigger on this. As I sit here with my bad screen that I keep severing my arm on, let's think about style. Dun, 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 dun. So we've talked about cognitive design, and your cognitive design is the stuff that allows players to understand the game, and then style is the stuff that makes it look cool, right? It's the stuff that makes it look unique. It's the stuff that when people look at the typeface you've used or the colors you've used, it evokes something for them emotionally, or it could be that it interacts with their previous knowledge and they see, you know, if you see this typeface, this makes me think of like Art Deco or Art Nouveau and like flappers and stuff like that. So, you know, this is the type of art style I might associate with people doing a seance in a building in New York in 1930, or like Gatsby or something like that, right? All of these kind of associations are the stuff that play into what we would normally call style. Yeah, cognitive load theory. And yeah, and what Egghead is asking is if I change panels during combat, I still want to keep it to 7. So yeah, I guess the idea is if you have combat and you change from like one mode to another, and the next mode is still relatively complicated, then you want to make sure you hide everything that's irrelevant from the last mode, right? So you don't like open up a new window that's got 7 or 6 or 8 bits of new information on and leave everything else behind it. So now you're overwhelmed because you can see 15 things, right? You take stuff away as you bring new information in, so you're not giving people too much to process. Because even if they sort of logically know, I should ignore that thing over there, it's usually better to just take it away anyway. Because otherwise they might think, well, why have they left it there? Maybe I need to pay attention to that. And it's just not visually there to draw your eye anymore as well. So this is a good one to think about. And it's often a thing that you need to sort of decide upon globally across your whole project. So these are two different, really broad, different approaches to interface design that have quite a lot to do with style. Skeuomorphism is the school of design where we take a digital thing and we try and make it look like a thing from the real world, right? So skeuomorphism includes things like this old Instagram app icon where it looks like a camera, and things like having a save item, having a save icon that is a floppy disk. That's skeuomorphism, right? Because we are indicating the function of something by making it look like something else, by making it look like something physical often. Whereas flat design is it's flat, right? So when we make an interface and we try and make the thing look three-dimensional so that we can see that this is a button because it's poking out, that's a skeuomorphism where we are even the idea that a thing on a screen is a button is a skeuomorphic concept, because we are taking the idea of a thing that is like a physical thing that you interact with, like a key on a keyboard, and turning it into like a conceptually something that you push down on from outside in order to create an interaction. And you know, Oblivion and Skyrim are examples of these two different tendencies. In Oblivion, both the remastered one and the original, you have the idea of the interface being a book, right? Whereas in Skyrim, we've got a much flatter design, and both these approaches have different pros and cons. The flat design looks more modern. It looks a lot cleaner. You can fit more information in because you don't have as much kind of decorative nonsense in. And you can also see that they didn't go all the way, right? So on the Skyrim example, you've got these little kind of, they're like a mix between Nordic runes and sort of Art Deco stuff in the corners, these little details in the corners. So you've got this kind of mix of a very modern thing and something that's still a little bit like referencing something older. And then in the Oblivion example, we've got like the tattered edges of this being like in a book. You've got that sort of wooden or metal scroll detail at the top, and these slightly faded icons for categories that look like they've been hand drawn. So it's all kind of creating the idea of the interface being an object, right? So this can often feel a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit outdated, but it's also very charming. And I think one of the reasons why it's helpful to think about these things in the specific context of making indie games rather than making AAA games is when people play indie games, they are often looking for something personal and charming and quirky, and not necessarily sleek. And if we think back to the DICE talk from earlier, he was talking about this kind of idea of trying to make the interface disappear, right? Which is the kind of sleek approach. It's what most AAA games go for. And I know we can all joke about, you know, Ubisoft games and having map markers everywhere, but there's still this idea of everything being smooth and sleek, and it's an interface, it's not an object in the world or whatever. I think skeuomorphism tends to give us like a more quirky approach that the type of people that are specifically drawn to indie games are often going to like. You know, we're not as into the idea of being totally immersed in a realistic simulation of something. So the idea of the interface itself being this like playful object that is deliberately drawing attention to itself by, you know, having playful typography, like having this like, you know, what would you call that? Like a quill pen type typography and stuff like that. It kind of feels a bit more charming. It feels less kind of sleek and modern. And again, the point is that there isn't a right or wrong thing to go for here. They have pros and cons in terms of how people perceive them and interact with them. Yeah, I don't know if that one's modded the Skyrim one. I think it might be, but it's the general style of it is still kind of the same. And yeah, if you want to kind of think of this in as a chronological thing where games have started with one thing and moved away from it, then Zelda is another good example of this. Because if you look at Ocarina of Time, you've got these chunky blocks that sort of represent a piece of wood with things carved into it, right? You can see all of those little highlights where things are beveled, like the Triforce there is beveled, and it's very kind of clunky and tactile. It feels very dated now, but again, we're making indie games. Dated is sometimes what we're going for because we're going for something that evokes a particular time period or whatever. Breath of the Wild, much flatter. It's similar to the Skyrim interface. We don't have any kind of decorative fonts here. All of the type is sort of sans serif, very clean. You know, if you looked at this without, if you looked at the Breath of the Wild interface without the character and the objects in and said, where is this game set? I don't think most people would get to medieval fantasy from that, apart from the fact that you can see like a bow icon in the interface, right? Yeah, the Pip-Boy is a great example of a terrible good interface. This was just a little gag I found online about the best form of video game skeuomorphism, which is when your mouse cursor turns into a tiny little gauntlet. And here it's explaining the very correct position that this represents the entirety of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Our basic needs, psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs can all be met by having a little skeuomorphic hand to interact with the world with. I think all social media would be improved tenfold if we went back to the gauntlet pointer. So I've got these next couple of slides are really just coming back to that point from earlier that the AAA developer made about taking influence from other places. And the thing I like about this slide is if you looked at it at a glance, you would just think it was all the same thing. But over here on the left, we have Mini Metro, which is a game about building train stations and train routes. And the entire game is an interface. You know, you interact. There's nothing in here that is a representation of a train beyond that little icon in the corner, right? This is a game that is about interacting directly with the interface. It's all an abstraction. But one of the lovely things about this game is it's all designed around the graphical manuals for the New York City Transit Authority, right? So this is a really cool example of just taking a thing from the world. And there are various GDC talks on the development of this. I think it started off as a very simple Ludum Dare entry, and I think the UI designer joined the team later on when they went into full production. But you can kind of see how you could start off with this as a concept, and then when you realize, okay, this kind of looks like tube maps, now we'll do this kind of deeper dive into what do tube maps look like, and will help to create this association between what you're doing in the game and this thing in the real world, which is such a neat way of making a very minimalistic game with quite a low art need in terms of production, but which is really, really evocative and like makes people think of something familiar, you know? We like familiar things. It helps us make associations between the real world and the game. And every time you do this with graphic design, it means you can avoid having to do it by animating a 3D train or animating 100 people at a train station, or all of the things that you'd normally have to do in terms of like asset creation to make a game about running a train company. You'd usually have to lean very heavily on realistic representations of things. As soon as you start thinking about like, how can I present this game as an interface, and how can I use things from like the history of graphic design to build that interface, you're starting to create similar associations that make the thing appealing to people, but you're not having to kind of create all of those realistic art assets. Yeah, it's really nice. It's really clean. And it's just like this set of colors here. It's like you can kind of just see how this relates to this in a really satisfying way. So the slightly annoying position that I probably take this as my standard position, really, because I think if you're a game designer, then you probably think about this stuff all the time. I think if you're an interface designer in like a big studio and that's all you do, maybe it's more like the interface is a separate part because it's what you're working on. But as a game designer, everything in your game that's interactive needs to communicate in a particular way. So there's this position. Christine Jorgensen's book, Game World Interfaces, there was a really good episode of Game Studies Study Buddies, a podcast about this recently. And this is the gist of the argument of this book. Game system information is any representation of the game system that is made available to the player, or which provides a certain type of game information to the player, regardless of whether this information is superimposed or made available inside the game world environment. So if we think of the distinction we had earlier between the user interface and the diegesis, now there are loads of things in the diegesis that are giving us information about what's happening in the world, right? I can see from this still, I can look at these kind of people's jetpack things and I can see their direction of movement. There's player color on things that lets me know that this is my stuff because I'm the red team. You know, there's going to be There's going to be, if I'm a Terran and I'm fighting another Terran, but they're blue, then I can see which units are theirs and which are mine. That's not the user interface. It's the diegesis, but the point is, it's all the front end. It's all the stuff that the player sees and interacts with. And this is one of the reasons why, when we look at the diegesis, when we look at the world of the game, and we take away all this black and white stuff I've put around the edge, you still need to have like a hierarchy within that of what is most important to the gameplay at any given moment. And that is why, we've got, when we look at the kind of stone and grass and stuff, it looks really pretty. It looks lovely. But there's not loads of like high contrast stuff in here drawing our eye away from the gameplay relevant information, right? So the actual game world is following a lot of the same principles that we've been talking about, and we've been applying them all to interface, but the game world follows the same rules. And this is one of the reasons why AAA games have to do things like yellow painting so much, is because the more that the game tries to represent like a real place, the more visually noisy it gets, and the less the game is able to teach you how to play it, right? Whereas if we've got a more stylized art style, which is a weird turn of phrase, but if we've got like a art direction where everything is a bit more stylized and less going for realism, it becomes easier to just naturally pick out details by making something a different color or giving it a harsher outline or whatever set of things it is that you do with it, I don't know if anyone saw my playthrough of Blood Thief, or if anyone has played Blood Thief, but that game is a very good example of this, because it's kind of a boomer shooter where you're speed running and you're jumping off things and wall running and everything. And the fact that it is, it looks like a ID Software game from 1995. The fact that the whole level is made up of these very simple shapes makes it very, very easy to play this speedrunning gameplay, because at any given moment you can very clearly read the situation. As soon as you start to throw in like loads of clutter and loads of bushes and stuff, it might look beautiful. It might make it feel more like you're in a real place and immersed in a fictional world and stuff like that. But it often creates gameplay problems, and that is why AAA companies have started doing things like painting arrows everywhere and like highlighting things in yellow, is because realism doesn't lend itself to clarity of this kind of stuff that we're talking about here. The kind of more stylized something is, the more you can start making decisions based on what does the player need to know, what does the player need to focus on, what does the player need to not focus on, and less on like what would this really look like. And you can see examples of that here, like the terrain in StarCraft. It's got lovely little bumps and textures in and stuff, but they're not super high contrast. They're not drawing your attention away from the units and the things you need to be paying attention to. So you can see all of these little details and cracks in the terrain, but there's nothing like a massive multicolored mural painting on the floor or anything like that, because it would just be distracting and confusing. Yeah, I think Blood Thief is one of the better new indie games coming from a YouTuber that I've played in the last year since I started this channel. Really, really good. Ape out, because I bring it up in every video that we do. But this was a really neat example of like, it's kind of a diegetic interface, but it's also just what you would expect to happen. The orange blood comes out of the orange ape, and that lets us know we're wounded. This is an interesting one, because contextually in the game we don't need a health bar. We just basically need to know if we're at full health or if we're about to die if we get hit again. And that allows this game to have this really minimalistic approach of having no graphical user interface, because we don't need degrees of health in a game like this. We just need to understand like how healthy we are in a very, very loose way so that we can react to that. Left 4 Dead, I didn't know where else to put this in the presentation, but this was an interesting example, like historically. In Left 4 Dead, you have these glows around the other players and you can see them through walls. And there is a realism mode that turns those off, and it just totally changes the game. And that's an example of like a helper mechanic where you might just need to do something to help players understand the game, and then you can take it away again later to make your kind of hard mode or to make your hardcore mode. But people just couldn't play the game without this, and so they had the option to turn it off, but that was like the realism mode that allowed you to do that. But for a very long time, they were developing it without that, and people really needed that to be able to kind of play the game without having to constantly tell each other where they were, you know. Yeah, few more indie game examples before we get onto your games that you've submitted. So, Fields of Mystria, what's happening here? We've got a skeuomorphic interface. I'm just going to kind of run through everything that this interface is doing, right? We've got a skeuomorphic interface because it's a book, right? The fact that it's a book gives us a bunch of clues as to how it works, right? So we understand that these are tabs, because that's kind of a diary thing, and we've seen that in other games. We've seen it in the real world. We have this kind of style for the headings where it's got its own pink bit, and that helps to kind of break everything up visually so that we can see what belongs to what. And you know, we're familiar with the idea that a title for something goes above it, but that kind of breaks it up into these sections where you've got a section here, section here, section here, section here. And there's also this use of these this kind of turquoise color on certain things, and those all seem to be like the achievement based things. It's like your skills, your town rank, your level. And the thing I would think about here, if you're like a pixel art person or you're making pixel art projects, is the use of black outlines here is actually quite sparing, right? It's used on the objects, on the outside of the objects, not on like every line in the object. And then the divisions within this that are maybe not as important for us to think about are done with these lighter grays, right? Because again, black is it's a way of picking things out and making them more distinct. And if you, whatever your strategy is for making something look more important, if you do it in more places, then it doesn't, it becomes less useful, right? So if every single line on this page was a black outline, it would be a lot harder for people to kind of read this and make sense of it, because it would be like everything is yelling for their attention. It's like the visual artistic equivalent of typing in all caps. It like feels like everything is trying to get your attention, right? Let's skip ahead a little bit to some examples from our Discord members. This is a nice example of taking a style that is evocative of something in the real world. So shout out to Papa Murph from our Discord, who is working on Negative Space, which is a really nice little deck builder. And I had to go and look up what this style was called. But basically, you had something called the Memphis style, which is like all of the triangles and like black and white checkers and stuff, like Saved by the Bell and lots of 90s shows had these backgrounds that were in the Memphis style. And then the style that was used for like Nickelodeon cartoons was called Memphis Junior, which is like the wobbly kids version of that. And this whole game is kind of using that style. I'm not sure if the developer was like conscious of that, but it's got like a musical style that goes with it and everything as well. So this is a really nice example of where the style is kind of driving all of the interface design. Let's have a look at some examples that people sent me on Discord. So this is Valentin, who I think this game is going to be in Indies Under the Knife next week when we do the wizard stream. So this is a game where you are a wizard and you are blowing up various types of wildlife. So we've got like two different menus from the same game, I think, here. And I think we can kind of have a quick look through this and see what we think in general. So by all means, in the chat, please highlight anything that kind of jumps out at you. One of the things I do like is we've got some sort of distinction between... Oh no, I'm not sure we have actually. So one of the things I would do on this menu, I think these are like different animals you've killed. I would say when these are 0, I would darken the icon so that the ones that we've actually got some score on seem more important. Because at the moment, it's kind of almost hard to see the difference between that being a 7 and that being a 0, because we've got like a white icon next to all of the 0 things, and it makes it less obvious which things are 0 and which are just a low number. It's version 5 and 1. So this is the one we started on, right? This is where your first one. And I think, yeah, the dark background is making it easier to read because this is like white on a very pale grey. And then I think one of the issues I might have with this side is just that there's a big gap here. And if you want to know a like dark pattern graphic design thing that happens in the real world, the only place you really see this in the real world is menus in expensive restaurants, right? They put the title of the thing over here, and then they put a massive gap. So you see, roast chicken, and then the roast chicken costs like $50. But because they've put a massive gap, it takes you a while. So you've already decided you want it. And then when you look all the way over there and see it's $50, then you're like, oh, that sucks, but I'm going to buy it because I want it already. Right? That's the only practical context where having that big gap has a reason for it. In this case, it feels like, you know, if you tried to glance from block over to that 30, you might there's the distance between these things means you could accidentally read it as block 550, right? Because the longer this gap is, the more I'm likely to misassociate the thing on the left with the thing on the right. So we've got some suggestions of maybe making the achievements section its own color. I think one of the things I struggle with a little bit is I've got like a skull icon up here with a score on it, and then I've got this down here, which is the same icon. But this is the same icon here. I can't really... Now, the game might explain itself when you're playing it, but I can't see how this relates to this by just glancing at this screen. I think some of this... So some of this is like the player's actual score, right? Which is why we've got these strange numbers like 7 and 249. Whereas these seem to be more like target numbers for something. These aren't something that the player has done. So I would maybe try and work out a different visual style for, like, if this is static information about goals, then these panels should maybe have their own style compared to these, which are like, these have been filled out by the player's data, right? And then I think with these icons and the zeros, when something is at 0, I would do something else with it to make it clear that that one is empty. Like maybe the border can be a bit faded, the icon can be darker, so that in this whole achievements panel we can see that actually I got a score here, but all of the others are things I didn't get, right? And in terms of what an achievements panel is supposed to do, that will then help, because players will look at this at a glance and they'll start to learn over time that if they killed like everything, then more of this will be lit up, you know? Yeah, so these are score thresholds. So this is like static information that doesn't relate to what the player did. It's what the player is aiming for. So I would maybe try and present this as if it's a different type of information from these. Because these are readouts of something the player did. And these are like goals, you know? So maybe if you think this darkened style is like, this is a receptacle for information to go into from the game that the player's just played. Whereas this is more like a message board, right? So if these are like, maybe this should look a bit more like a kind of, like it sticks out a little bit. Maybe it's like a dark bronze and the text is in a different color or something. Because this is static information, whereas this is changeable variables. And that would immediately help me understand what's the difference between this and this. And then over here, yeah, I think this gap is just too big, really. Lydia, yes, there's a. If you go onto the homepage of my YouTube, there is a submission form on there for Indies Under the Knife, which is the show I do every Thursday where I review people's games. But we get quite a lot of submissions, so I do it based on theme. So if I look at the backlog and there's 4 games that where you're a wizard, then we'll do a wizard week or something like that. Because when I was trying to do them chronologically, we just didn't get through them all in a quick order. Oh. And then I think in terms of style, I don't know much about this game yet. I'm going to try and just read into it from these screens. But this typeface feels like a very heavy sci-fi type. Like a military sci-fi thing. Like a StarCraft or something like that. That's what this typography reads as to me. Is like a StarCraft or a Halo. Maybe like a modern spy thriller setting like you would get in a Michael Bay movie when it goes to the White House and it says the White House at the bottom of the screen, in case you didn't know it was the White House. This kind of typeface makes me think of that kind of 90s action movie type thing, and mainly more like a sci-fi type action movie. The color scheme is very legible. I think Nuno is right. The text stands out very easily on this dark blue. The dark blue stands out quite nicely on the green of the background. And this kind of gold color allows you to have borders and sections without it being too bold. Because one of the things that people often do is they put borders on things that are like the most high contrast color. And that border isn't actually that important. It's moderately important. It's like in the middle of the information hierarchy. But like if this gold border was white, it would suddenly be like glaring at us as really important, and it would take away our ability to concentrate on the numbers, which are also white. So having this kind of mid shade of gold as the border color is a really neat choice as well. I think the color scheme is pretty good there. And this is like the older version, and you can already see like this is kind of way too low contrast. But yeah, I would think about what this style and what the typographic choices kind of communicate about this game, because it feels very science fiction at the moment from what I can see there. Here we have Sam. I don't know if Sam's still in the chat. This is like a universe map from a card game. And this has been an interesting one to watch in the Discord, because we've had lots of conversations about this where I was like, make it more Star Trek-y. I think this is about as Star Trek-y as you can get now, but I think that maybe is introducing a problem here where if we do a squint test on this, it's like I can just make out the dotted green lines, which are probably the most important thing for me to focus on. But all of the yellow-orange around the edge is really, really drawing quite a lot of attention. And I do wonder, like, Star Trek is a very good stylistic reference for this type of stuff because it will make the player like associate it with that. But maybe some of these brighter, warmer colors need to just be dulled down a little bit. So it's almost like they are like, if you imagine each of these bits being like its own little flickering panel, you could have a state where the orange is very dull or a bit darker and it looks dimmed. And then if you need to draw attention to something, you can kind of flicker it. So you kind of what's going on over here where this looks like a brighter version of this, right? So it says systems here and it's got these things, and I don't know if these are clickable, but this looks kind of high priority at the moment. And then all of this feels like it's drawing quite a lot of attention, but I'm not sure if it needs to. So it's a tough one because this is starting to look really nice. We've got some kind of typographic stuff here where maybe this needs to be pushed over a little bit so it's not right up against this curve, the eye on here. But it is starting to look really nice. I just think these blocks of the kind of lighter colors maybe need to be used more sparingly so that everything else kind of feels a bit more background when it should be. Maybe, even just using more of this purple. I can't tell if this is a scroller or not. But if it is, then this is interactive. So if this is interactive and this isn't, then maybe this should use the purple and this should use the yellow, because the yellow is a hot color and it kind of just stands out a bit more than the purples and the blues. Hi Tom, you've joined us right near the end. So we did a big kind of walkthrough of loads of conceptual stuff for interface design, and now we're just looking at some practical examples from people's projects. So and this is from the same game. These are like the cards. And this is the before and after. So Sam, I went back and found this is where the game was when we first saw it. Yeah, Stefan just pointed out that the currency looks less important than this, right? So because the currency is a very dull color. But this is exactly what I was talking about when we at the beginning when we spoke about, you know, the fight between the elements of the stylistic art direction and the kind of cognitive design of like what do people understand when they look at this. It's like a little game of tennis where you constantly go back and forth between these, because I think you've done a very, very good job of nailing the Star Trek interface design. And now you've got all of the shapes and you've got the colors. And now it's a case of going back through it again and going, right, what on this screen is important? And taking some of the lighter, brighter colors on the things that aren't important, taking that off them and putting it on other things. So yeah, the currency is a good example of this, because that's like a maybe more important than all of this block round here that is kind of just a border, you know, it's decorative. The decorative stuff, maybe it can be cooler colors, maybe it can be the purples, the blues, maybe even darker versions of the purples and the blues, and then you save this warm orangey yummy color for everything that needs to have attention on it, you know. Even like this title, like Star Chart, we might read it once to see what we're looking at, but after that point, we don't need it to be in this kind of bold standout. Same with long range scanner as well. These are the types of things that give you context once, and then you sort of know what you're looking at, and you don't need that text again. So that's the kind of thing where it can be like a more of a backgroundy type color. But like stylistically, this is really great. I would just kind of, I'm very tempted to load this up in GIMP and select areas and start color swapping them, but I'm not going to do that today because we've already nearly run for 2 hours. But we've got inventory, and then this is the oldest version of the game that I saw. This was like the first one that we reviewed on the channel, and then this is kind of where it's ended up. And there's been a couple of iterations here in terms of just moving. I know actually this isn't totally the oldest because the ships used to be side by side. But you can already see there's a much clearer sense of like what I'm supposed to be focusing on here. I think it still has some of the problems of the previous page where this yellow bar attracts quite a lot of attention. And maybe it's not that important. Because this, again, if we squint at the screen and think of the Darkest Dungeon example from earlier where I blurred it, you squint at the screen and the white pops out, and then the yellow kind of color pops out even more than the white now, because it's kind of these two big blocks. Yeah, this kind of pinky purple, the yellow, and the white, and this bit of red are like the focal bits really. So I would maybe think about these edges, because it feels like it's making something important that maybe isn't that important. Yeah, the old one does look more grim and serious, but more importantly, for the cognitive design type stuff, this is the actual thing that you're doing most of the gameplay on, and you can't see like a massive amount of difference between the different elements. Everything looks okay, everything looks presentable, but you know, this is much clearer as these like are different cards and they're going to have different color borders and stuff like that. It feels a lot clearer than the older one. The older one is still pretty attractive and presentable, but it's just about, you know, applying all of the stuff that we've been talking about so far, you know. So I won't spend ages on that. Let's kind of get to some general stuff. And the general approaches that we've talked about today are, the first thing is taking existing approaches and applying them, which is what we've been trying to do throughout this. And sometimes that is taking the abstract thing of something like Gestalt theory and applying it to our games. And sometimes it is looking at other games and thinking, right, why did they do it this way? And then applying the same principles to what we're doing. And even if we're doing something in a different style, like, you know, we're looking at a fantasy game and we're making a sci-fi game, or we're looking at a dark, grim game and we're making a cozy game, even if we're doing something stylistically different, we can still look at the rules of that other thing, right? So we can look at the way that Darkest Dungeon does its graphic design and say, okay, they use these dark, gloomy colors to push things back and make them unimportant, and then they use these other colors to, maybe my game is a colorful pastel game, I can still use those same general principles in how I order my information and make things more or less important. I might just have slightly different rules about how I make something stand out because I don't have a load of black in my background to work with, for example. Now the second point is, at some point, you're just going to have to start from first principles of, right, my game works. I understand that my game works. It could be fun if someone understands it. I have fun sitting here playing it. But the players don't understand it. So what do they need to know? What do they need to know at every point? You know, I'm the programmer. I understand how everything in this game works. I can kind of guess what's going on moment to moment in terms of the variables in the game because I made it work that way. What do I need to do to communicate that and bring that to the surface? And sometimes there will be gameplay situations where hiding that is better, right? So the outlines on people in Left 4 Dead is an example of that, where you can give people a different experience by making certain information open or not. But a lot of the time, if there's information that it benefits the player to know, and, you know, as you're playtesting, you understand that, right, this isn't communicated, but I can play the game better because I know that that's how it works, then it does need to be communicated at some point in the game, right? And then the third one is just that, like, the uber point about every kind of design that we will just come across over and over again is, you're never going to get it right first time. You probably won't get it right third time. And just accepting that this is an iterative process, and, you know, however people might want to sell you a UI pack on the internet for, and you look at it and you think, oh, that looks really good, probably not actually going to serve the needs of your game. It might be a good starting point, but you're always going to have to modify things. You're always going to have to move things around. The gameplay in your game will change, and then the UI needs will change. The style or setting of your game will change, and then things will change. Just accepting that that is part of the process is just a really important part of design. Is, you know, you're never going to have like a solid idea in your head of what you're going to do, set out to do it, and then it's 100% perfect the first time. Even if you execute the idea perfectly, you'll give it to people and then they'll just break it because people be like that. So yeah, that's everything I have to say on this topic. Thank you all for popping in. Tom Gerbo said, on Under the Knife, are games limited to only being reviewed once? Kind of, yeah. So, but the way it tends to work is, when I've had a game on Indies Under the Knife, I then give the developers Discord invites, and then people who are in the Discord can sign up for our monthly thing, which is like a separate stream where people who are in the Discord can have their games reviewed. So it's not the same as the weekly Indies Under the Knife thing, but it's a similar approach type thing. So I do try and keep Indies Under the Knife to being a one-time only thing, because otherwise we'll just see the same game over and over again. And yeah, thank you all for coming. It's always great to do these things live with people in the chat. And thank you to supporters who are helping with this channel. This is my Rentometer that I built today. Don't look at how big the pixels are, because they're not perfectly right between the text and the iconography. I I do my best to do pixel art on Canva, but this is as good as I can get. So just to give you a sense of where I'm at in my YouTube educator journey, this entire string of coins represents my rent. This is what proportion of my rent I currently make on Google AdSense, with, you know, putting out a couple of videos a week that a thousand or 2,000 people watch. And then this is the proportion of my rent that is paid via Patreon subs and YouTube members and everything like that. So I wanted to make like a, you know, on charity shows they used to have like a thermometer that filled up, but I thought this was a better example given that we were doing interface today. Thank you all for coming. I did call it a lecture this time. We had a discussion last week in one of the chats about whether lecture was a dirty word, but someone very correctly pointed out that if you call things a workshop, it sounds more interactive rather than like someone delivering slides. So I'm just going to call these lectures going forward because I'd rather things were correctly labeled. Then that's more important than being popular, I think. Reverse German flag. Yep. My rentometer is actually a reversed German flag. Well, did I tell you, like, someone left a comment on one of my videos that said, thanks for the lecture. I really enjoy this lecture format on a recent video. And Google actually picked it up as potentially offensive, because I guess most of the time when people on the general internet say lecture, they're saying, don't lecture me, and they're in an altercation. So the what do you call it, the sentiment analysis of YouTube just assumed a comment was someone having a go at me because it had the word lecture in, even though they were saying thanks for the lecture. Jordan, I put these slides on the Patreon as like a bonus, so people that are subscribed to the Patreon do get the slides from this, and there's also, there will be an ad-free version of the video that goes on there. I don't put them anywhere else because I just don't really have anywhere to give away files like that at the moment. But yeah, thank you, Jamplay. Good luck with your projects. That always makes me, whenever anyone says good luck with your projects, it just makes me think of David Lynch saying that, and then I feel sad. Let's find him. Let's have a closer from David. Yeah. Where is he?
You have a very good heart, and so you have a very good heart, and you
your projects.
And so you have a very good heart, and you are interested in other human beings. You make people feel at ease, and you're very intelligent, and you have a very good heart. You have a very good heart, and you are...
It didn't have the bit where he says good luck with your projects, but you know. Thank you for coming. I will see you again soon. There will be another one of these in the next week or two, so yeah, feel free to, if you're in the chat afterwards, or if you're looking at this on the VOD and you have a particular topic, then just that you think we can kind of cover in this format, then let me know and I will work out what to do next, because I haven't actually planned the next one of these yet. And if it's something I'm not personally expert in, then we'll just do the same thing where it's like partially me gathering information from other places and then applying it to things that I think will be relevant to you guys, because it's you know, I'm a big proponent of, you should go and watch GDC talks, you should watch developers talk about their games, but sometimes when things are from like a AAA context, you do need to sort of translate them and make them relevant to smaller indie games, because the nature of what we're doing is just very different because we don't have massive teams of people. But yeah, thank you for joining.